Hello, and welcome to the Eiteljorg Museum. I'm Gayle Cox, and I want to take you on a little journey going west. You heard about going west, young man, going west, young woman. Well, that's where we're going, but in a very special direction with a very special theme to it. It's blacks in the West. What's the story behind the art? We're fortunate today to be in the Eiteljorg Museum that has a fascinating, at least what I think is a fascinating collection of art that has to do with black people. And I'm especially proud to focus on that as our theme today, simply because we seem to know so little about what black, African American, however you wish to designate them, what their contributions really were to the West, what their challenges were to the West. And we're going to start with a rendering by Edward Fronten, who I find to really be presenting a piece of art that has a very meaningful story behind it. If you will, kind of focus in on this figure. And as you look at the figure, what does it begin to tell you about the person? Obviously, it's a man on a horse, but look a little closer at that man. What message does he give you about who he is, what he is, or where he may even be going? He's obviously fairly tall. If he were standing beside us, I think we would see him as tall, and indeed he was. He was probably about 6 feet at least. As you look closer at him, you'll see a lot of muscularity. So he's strong. The artist has presented him as a strong man. And as you look closer, he obviously is a black man. A black man on a horse who is muscular. Who is this man? This is a man called York. Ed Fronten, as the artist, is a sculptor in Utah. That's where he was trained. Very drawn to the anatomy of both animals as well as people. So you see in the rendering of the man called York, a lot of attention to the anatomy. He's also a man that was interested in the West, from Utah, studied at the University of Utah. And so many of his renderings, both in the one you see here and across the country, have to do with Western themes. And generally, this is kind of an unusual piece for Ed Fronten, because usually his figures of animals and people are gigantic ones, and they appear in many of the public places, like the Mesa Verde in Colorado, a number of pieces in Oklahoma, usually at public places. The theme that he's presenting in York is not necessarily picked up by just looking at York, but the theme has to do with a period in our history shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, and that was the time in which then President Thomas Jefferson pulled together an expedition headed by, guess who? I'm sure you've heard of Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark had a rather elite team of people that were charged with the responsibility of trying to uncover and understand what was going on in the lands called the Louisiana Purchase. And Jefferson was particularly interested in trying to discover what was the best route from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. He was also interested in making sure that all the other countries knew that this was our land and our country. And so he charted this course for Lewis and Clark in a very purposeful way. One of the main reasons why he was interested in this land was not only the route and trying to find the shortest route, but also to look at what animals and what plants were a part of that area. So his team of people were very special in that they were prepared to take on that assignment. York was a part of that. And one wonders, why York? Why this black man? As it turns out, there's an interesting history between the relationship of Clark and York. And this relationship began early. York was the son of Old York, who was the slave of the Clark family. And when Clark was young York, the son of Old York, was given to him as a companion. And as such, one can only imagine the kinds of things that two young boys would do who were close in age. One slave, one master. York probably was privileged, though, in a number of ways, some of which he got to live in the big house as opposed to out in the fields and the cabins there. More than likely, he also was fortunate in that he got to eat the kind of food that the family ate, albeit in the kitchen. He probably had some of Clark's hand-me-down clothes. He was not taught to read or write because that was not a part of what slaves could avail themselves of. In addition to that, it was clear that he had a special place that was not the same as his companion, Clark. As he grew older, he became Clark's manservant, which meant that he would accompany him on trips. It also meant that more than likely he would make sure that his clothing was prepared, that his meals were served. In other words, to serve him, thus the name, manservant. But also he was a slave. So when Clark invited him to join this elite group of people on the expedition, there's no doubt that he thought of what York could provide. Certainly some safety and security, but also meet his needs. But he also knew that York being strong, more than likely that too would come in handy. And he was not wrong on any of those counts because the journey was an extremely difficult one. People suffered from dysentery, snake bites, sometimes hostile Indian tribes, and even at one point, his partner Lewis was even shot accidentally when one of the members of the team thought that he was an elk. And he was shot in an uncomfortable place that made it necessary for him to be on his belly for a portion of that journey while his bottom side healed. York aided the group in any number of ways. Number one, he was an excellent hunter, and the fact that they would allow a slave to carry a gun suggested that maybe they were pretty darn comfortable with him. He also was a good fisherman, and I point these areas of assistance that York provided because at times food was very scarce. When they came upon a hostile group, many of the native people had never seen a black man, and so he was kind of exotic. And Clark took real advantage of that. There was one native tribe that had the custom of, after a battle in which they had someone be really brave and victorious in battle, they would paint them with charcoal. And when they arrived at their campsite, everyone would really rejoice over this person who was seen as a hero. So they looked kind of at York as maybe being pretty heroic. In fact, some of them called him Great Medicine, and they were very deferential towards York, which also helped the Corps. In fact, I have just a passage that I'd like to read quickly, comments made by Clark about York. It said, Clark identifies York as having been identified as having great medicine. He said, I ordered my black servant to dance, which amused the crowd very much, and they were somewhat astonished that this so large a man could be so active, and that he was brave because he was black. Many of them had to come up and kind of touch him and rub him and to see if the black would come off, and were astonished when they couldn't rub it off. And this was a helpful portion of York's being with them on the journey. The journey took, round trip that is, approximately 2.5 years. They traveled 8,000 miles. They did make it to the Pacific and back to St. Louis. And when they arrived at St. Louis, it was a real celebration. Members of the Corps received financial rewards. Many received financial rewards and even land. York had no expectation of receiving financial reward or land, but he did have a hope. He did have a dream, and you probably can imagine what that dream was. It was a dream of freedom. And when he asked Clark to free him, the request was denied. Of course, York was crestfallen, and he said, in the words that I suspect he might have used, Massa, please let me go back to Louisville. That's where my wife is. And his wife was enslaved in Louisville. He said, I promise I will get work and I'll send the money back to you. Please, please let me go back to Louisville. And Clark's response was, no. We know that for at least 5 years post their return, York remained enslaved. There are some records that suggest that he might have remained in slavery even as late as 1811. After that, we really can only speculate as to what happened. Their relationship, we know, deteriorated. But that was the nature of things back in the 1800s with this particular black man in the West. This is a painting, a watercolor by Dean Mitchell. I'd like for you, the viewer, to take a careful look at this very special work of art. And I'd like for you to focus on where your eye is drawn. And I suspect it may be to the face of the figure, because the figure is pretty prominent. And Dean Mitchell, the artist, who is a watercolorist, has purposely kind of muted the background so that this figure has prominence. And as you're drawn to his face, what feelings do you think might emerge from the way that this figure presents? Do you see the pride? Do you see the dignity? Do you perhaps even see how weary he might be? There may be other things that you see as well as you're drawn to his face or as you're drawn to his body. He's looking straight forward at you in a way that suggests, I want you to see me as a human being. I want you to see me as a proud soldier. All of that helps to create the story behind this rendering. Dean Mitchell was born, or at least grew up, during the period of time when the great civil rights movement was occurring. So he certainly was, at a very young age, influenced by that. He's someone that doesn't want to glamorize the West. He's also someone who wants his artistic rendering to generate conversation. What has this man been through? Or what is he anticipating going into? This is a black Union soldier during the Civil War. If you reflect on your history during this time period, black people weren't welcomed into the military for a variety of reasons, certainly the least of which the fear that their presence might generate in terms of uprising on the slave plantations around. And the thought of having a black man with a gun wasn't something that people looked forward to. It was only probably really at the behest of President Lincoln that they were encouraged, they being black men, to join the Union Army. And his motives for having them join had to do with the fact that the numbers of white men volunteering for service was dropping, and he was desperate. But he was really torn in terms of whether or not he should recruit black men, because of the fact that there would be really a backlash on the part of certainly the border states. But it was out of a real need that he wanted to recruit black men. Initially, when the recruitment started, there were very few people that were willing to jump in to the battle. It wasn't until Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, really moved in and encouraged black men to join the Union Army. And he held out the carrot of, if you join the Army, that's going to increase your ability to have full citizenship. And that message resonated to the point where probably somewhere over 186,000 black men joined the military. That represented probably about 10% of the military force. A sizable number of those men did not make it, but many did to the end of the war. But sadly, they faced a lot of discrimination while they were in the service of the Union Army. Number one, the kinds of jobs that they were given, and certainly there were many of them that were in the infantry and the artillery portions of the military. But a lot of them were assigned to jobs like cooks, construction, the kind of menial jobs that took them away from the actual fighting. In addition to that, no black man was allowed to be an officer, although towards the end of the war, a number of them became petty officers, but in general, they always had white officers over them, which was kind of a mixed blessing in some ways, because many of the white officers who were in charge, even though they had officer status, the fact that they were assigned to a colored unit was not something that many of them looked forward to. And as a result, sometimes provided rather harsh treatment for the men who were under their care. So it was a mixed blessing for black men to be in the Union Army. But the thought of, once I come through this, I'm going to be a full citizen, is what the dream was. And that was a large part of their motivation. I think Dean Mitchell has done a good job of kind of portraying a lot of that history in this rendering. It's kind of interesting. I ran across a quote by one of the white Union officers that I'd like to share with you, because I think it tells the story rather well. This Union captain went on to say, "A great many white people have the idea that the entire Negro race are vastly their inferiors. A few weeks of calm, unprejudiced life here would disabuse them, at least I think so. I have a more elevated opinion of their abilities than I ever had before. I know that many of them are vastly the superiors of those who would condemn them to a life of brutal degradation. That coming from a white Union captain kind of shows what happens when people work together and get to know one another. As it turned out, these black Union soldiers were exemplary. They had the lowest rate of desertion of any of the military units. So, do you think Dean Mitchell captured that? I do. Absolutely a museum favorite. What strikes you about this oil on canvas painting by Bernard Williams? It has to be its enormity. There's no way you can miss it. But look a little deeper and reflect on what might be the story behind this painting called The Black Cowboy. When you look at him, obviously it's huge, it's enormous, but there's more to it. What parts of his face just kind of jump out at you? And I bet it's the smile. It's the teeth. Which says to me the artist wants us to kind of focus on the teeth when one looks at the face. Do you see joy in the man? I do. I see joy, which says, I'm doing something that I like doing. He's looking directly at us as well. And he's probably saying, do you know I am Bill Pickett? Well, who is Bill Pickett? I'll tell you in a moment. But I want to tell you a little something about Bernard Williams before I do that. Bernard is a University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana graduate and also Northwestern University. Has a master's in fine arts. When he received his master's in fine arts, one of his first jobs was working with some high school students on, guess what? Murals. Could that be related to why the size of this painting? I suspect it might. He also is someone who worked with a group who were looking at the history of murals around Chicago. So I can't help but feel that the largeness of this painting may have something to do with his fascination for, his work in, and his interest in murals as well. He's not only a painter, but he's also a sculptor, and I wish we had some of his works around because he uses found objects to create fascinating sculpture. But he obviously was fascinated by this man called Bill Pickett. Bill Pickett was the son of slaves. And I do mean people who had been in slavery only, out of slavery, excuse me, for only 5 years. So that experience was near and dear to his heart. What many people don't realize is that black folks and cowboys, those roles have been a part of black history since the beginning of time. Many slaves had as their roles taking care of cattle, herding cattle. So it's significant in that it's an integral part of the kind of work that especially black men did back in the day. I kind of find it amusing that when I reflect on black westerns, growing up, I never saw a black cowboy. Even though historians say that 1 out of 4 cowboys were black folks. What happened to that history? What happened to that history? Well, Bill Pickett certainly made history. And he made it for a number of reasons. He grew up in a family. In fact, his parents were involved in working on a ranch with cattle, with horses. So as a little kid, he literally cut his teeth on working with cattle. As a little boy, he loved to listen to his folks talk about some of their adventures with cattle. And he also enjoyed watching the various techniques having to do with how people handle cattle. And one day he was sitting down and he was watching a bulldog herd some cattle. And he noticed that when the bulldog was able to get close enough and bite the cattle in the lip, or bite the cow in the lip, bite the bull in the lip, that animal stood perfectly still. And that fascinated him, and it germinated in his mind. How is that possible? So as he grew older, he started trying that himself. Can you imagine? Biting the lip to maintain or to gain control. And once having gained control in that way, then they could actually lasso or use a lariat to rein that animal in. He and his brothers started a business of breaking in horses, cattle, what have you. But during that time, it's very difficult for a black man to be in business and earn enough money to make a living. So in addition to the business that they ran, they picked cotton and worked on other ranches. It's the only way you can make it. But word got out that this guy, this Bill Pickett, had some special talent. And some promoters discovered him. And thought, maybe we could use him in rodeos. Except there was only one problem. Black people couldn't participate in rodeos with white cowboys. So they gave him a name that was kind of ambiguous. Instead of using his real name, they tried to disguise what nationality or what race he was by just calling him Dusty. That could apply to a lot of people. But it was also apropos in terms of the way in which he was able to handle cattle. I'd like to give a little description of his technique. He started out calling it the bite down style. But as his career moved along and as it became more popular in the ranks of the rodeo, the bulldogging became the moniker that he used, that he was the bulldogger. And this is essentially how he handled it. Number one, on his horse, he'd leap off his saddle. He grabbed the horns of the bull, pull the head back with the nose up. He sinks his teeth into the steer's upper lip, raises his hands in the air, showing that the only thing holding this animal is my mouth on his lip. Then he turns the animal over by falling to one side until both come to a dusty stop. He's got him. He's got him. Bulldogger. He would go on to travel throughout the world. Wild Bill's rodeo. He would go on to do the Cheyenne Western days. He would visit foreign nations. He even performed before English royalty. He was on the top of his game. And let me tell you, this was dangerous business, because I think he probably fractured it or broke almost every bone in his body. But he loved the work, he enjoyed the work, and he was good at the work, and he was the best. He died at age 62. And 33, notice I'm not saying 3, but 33 years after he died, he was finally put in the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. Took him a little while. He was the first black man to ever be named to the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. That was Bill Pickett and his contributions to the West. What a fun piece. This is what makes the Eiteljorg Museum so special. When are you going to have as an art piece as well as a piece that can be touched and sat in and even rocked than to have a real stagecoach? And the stagecoach has a special piece or a special part of Western history when you think of it as something that was really essential in terms of getting mail to its destination, carrying freight, and also carrying people. And today I'm going to talk about the coach, but I'm also going to talk about a very special personality who might surprise you, who was the driver of a coach like this. The coach itself, as I mentioned, certainly was important in terms of carrying mail and freight and people. But when you examine it and try and put yourself as a person riding a stagecoach, think about the fact that these roads during these early days were rough. And sometimes had to not only drive along rough roads, but up mountain passes and over forks and rivers and what have you. So it had to be a pretty stable and well-constructed piece. As you examine the size of the wheels that help with that balance, and think about probably as many as even 9, I've heard, passengers inside, and maybe 1 or 2 on top. It was a well-constructed vehicle. It traveled probably 12 to 15 miles before they had a change of what was moving the vehicle, which turned out to be horses or mules. And probably was able to travel somewhere close to, that I have, 5 to 12 miles an hour. So you weren't going long distances in a short period of time, and you were on rough roads and crossing forks in the river and what have you. So I'm not sure that I would see it as a pleasure ride. But the construction itself kind of helped in terms of making it as comfortable as possible. As you can see, it was built high and wide, kind of a curved frame to give it strength, balance wheels, steel springs resting on what they call thorough braces made of thick bull hide that kind of provides a rocking motion. It does rock, you know. In fact, Mark Twain said it reminded him of a cradle, a rocking cradle, a big rocking cradle. Just kind of imposing, but necessary for a particular time in our history, and available for people who are fortunate enough to visit the Eiteljorg so that you can climb in and actually see it. Leather seats, not bad, that offered some cushioning, so just kind of a delight. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a special person that has always intrigued me with respect to the stagecoach. And her name was Mary Fields. Mary was born into slavery in Tennessee, picked cotton most of her life. She was 33 years a slave. That to me says a lot. 33 years, many of which were bent over picking cotton as a slave. Think what that might do to one's personality and outlook on life. She was also a big woman. She was close to 6 feet tall, I understand. So that means that probably the expectations of her on a slave plantation may have been close to that of the expectations for males I'm just speculating, but I'm trying to put myself in her position. 33 years a slave. When she was free, one of her early jobs was on a Mississippi steamboat where she worked as a laundress. Eventually, she would find her way to having a job taking care of 5 children for a judge and his wife. And she had a special passion for children, and they in turn had one for her. The judge's wife unfortunately passed, and Mary was asked to accompany the children to Toledo, Ohio, to be with an aunt. The aunt turned out to be a Mother Superior, Sister Amadeus. And Sister Amadeus and Mary, for all that I can discover, or all that I've read about her, became friends. Sister Amadeus was a warm-hearted person, and obviously a compassionate one, because Mary wasn't always the easiest person to get along with. 33 years a slave. When Mary arrived in Ohio with the children, delivering the children to their aunt, Sister Amadeus, she became something of a personal servant for the sister, and did whatever personal things she needed to have done, while the good sister carried out many of her administrative functions for the mission. It was at that time that she was called to Montana to open up a mission for Blackfeet Indian girls and women. But Mary decided that she would remain in Ohio. A few years later, she got word that Sister Amadeus was very ill. And because of the friendship that they had established, she decided she would go and try and be of some assistance to the sister, which she did. And thankfully, Sister Amadeus did get better. But while she was there, waiting on and helping the sister to heal, the sister asked her if she would perform the duties of getting their freight from the mission to places where it needed to be delivered. And that's when she first became in charge of not a stagecoach, but a conveyance somewhat like it, that was horse-drawn as well. It was hard work, and it was the kind of work, if you might imagine how underdeveloped this area was in Montana. A lot of snow, so she would be making these deliveries in weather that often was harsh. At one point in time, while she was making a delivery, wolves came in and were barking at the horses and spooked the horses, and the wagon turned over. But Mary, being Mary, was able to stave off the wolves and turn the wagon back to its original position. And this was in the cold of the night. So it was not an easy job at this time, but it was one that she enjoyed because it gave her a lot of freedom. I don't know, and this is purely speculative on my part, and I keep coming back to 30 years as a slave. sometimes Mary's relationships with other people were not the best, shall I say. She could be quite terse, and especially terse when she felt that people were in some way taking advantage of her. Such things as she had the responsibility for caring for the lawn, or what could be considered the lawn around the grounds, but she'd get very upset if anybody would walk on it. So that it ended up that she had a lot of run-ins with folks. But the good sisters at the mission, and certainly Sister Amadeus, loved her and felt she made an important contribution to their work. There were times, though, that one would raise real question, and one of those times was she had a bit of a shootout with the janitor. Word got back to the bishop, who had heard other things about Mary and her temper. And while no one was hurt in the shootout, she had enough run-ins that had come to the attention of the bishop, till the bishop informed Sister Amadeus that Mary had to go. So she was fired from this job, but Sister Amadeus, to the rescue, set her up in a restaurant, because along with the love of children and special people, the other thing that Mary really loved was cooking. And so she had this restaurant, and it was going pretty well, except she found it difficult to turn anybody who was hungry away. And as a result of that, guess what? She went bankrupt. That was the end of the restaurant. Sister Amadeus to the rescue, encouraged Mary to seek a job driving a stagecoach delivering mail. During the application process, she was the fastest applicant to be able to hitch up 6 horses than any other applicant, and got the job immediately. She loved the job. Again, it was a hard job, but what has she done that wasn't hard? And she was 60 years old when she got the job. She was the second woman in the country to have the position of delivering U.S. mail under a star contract. She was the first black woman to have ever received that position. So it was something really quite special. So special that we even have a stamp out. I don't know whether it's still available, showing her because of her position in having been awarded this contract. She was the kind of person that she was going to deliver the mail, doing whatever it took. And sometimes, because the snow was so deep, she would don a pair of snowshoes, put the mail on her back, and it got delivered. She never missed a day of work in the 10 years that she was delivering mail. When she finally retired, she decided to open up a laundry, did washing. She was also doing babysitting. She loved being around kids. She also loved something else that I hadn't mentioned earlier. She loved to go to a saloon and kind of join the gang of cowboys and what have you, and have a little drink. And one day she was in the saloon and this man walked in who hadn't paid his laundry bill, who refused to pay his laundry bill. She walked up behind him, tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned around, she gave him a punch that knocked him out and announced, "Bill paid in full." That was Mary Fields. That was Mary Fields. Her laundry caught fire, and which was fairly typical during those days because they had very few fire prevention strategies, so it was not unusual, but it was a tragic event. She was so cared for by this community up in Cascade County, Montana, that they bought lumber and provided the labor and built her a brand new laundry. That's saying what the people thought of this black woman in literally a white community in a place called Montana. When she died at age I've forgotten. When she died, she had the biggest funeral that anybody had ever had. They just really turned out to bid farewell to a woman who'd made quite an impression on their community. And she was beloved, and they buried her at a very special place between the mission in which she had worked and the little town that she loved. And every day on her birthday, and this was even while she was alive, everybody would celebrate her birthday. Everything closed for Mary Fields Day up in this town in Montana. So we've talked about York, who made a special contribution to the Lewis and Clark expedition. In fact, one might wonder, would Lewis and Clark have made it on this journey without York? We've talked about For Freedom and Dean Mitchell's lovely rendering of a Union soldier. And I've been intrigued by that title, For Freedom. It's as if one word is missing in the title, and that word is fighting. Fighting for freedom. Because after all, isn't that what those Union soldiers were doing? They were fighting for their freedom. And think about the contributions that they made to the development, not only of the West, but of this nation. And then there was Mary Fields and her delivering the mail and what she gave to the community, and they recognized her gifts and gave back. And then there was the son of slaves, Bill Pickett. Crushed every bone in his body, cracked every bone in his body, proving that a black man was up there with the best of the best, demonstrating his ability to perform through a special technique, a unique technique, to perform as an outstanding rodeo personality. One wonders, and I should perhaps say I wonder, why didn't we learn this in our history? With that, I'd like to give you the invitation to explore further the history of blacks in the West and invite you to visit the Eiteljorg Museum, where we've been fortunate enough to have art that helps us tell the story of blacks in the West. Thank you so much.